Hi, I'm Jason Alexander, or as you probably know me, Royal Flusher 25 from WSOP free-to-play app. WSOP players, I have some free chips just for you. Go hit the tables like the legends you are. Download the WSOP free-to-play app where you can win rings and bracelets and tournaments and show them off to everyone at the table.
If you love poker, play poker with 1 million extra chips using this promo code, WSOPFREE1M.
This episode of the Race F1 podcast is sponsored by Zbiotics. Zbiotics is an absolute game changer because if, like me, you're in your mid-40s, having a night out with a few drinks can leave you feeling considerably worse the next day, and you can't bounce back the way you did when you were in your 20s. But with Zbiotics, you don't have to make that choice between having a great night or a great next day. There's a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. It's with pre-alcohol. Zbiotics Pre-Alcohol Probiotic Drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. And in the words of Jennifer Aniston, here's the science bit. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. And it's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. So, just remember to make Zbiotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Try it for yourself and you will believe the hype. Go to zbiotics.com/race to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use RACE at the checkout. Zbiotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. That's the letter Z, or Z if like me you're in the UK, BIOTICS.com/race and the code RACE at checkout for 15% off. One last time, zbiotics.com/race.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and is George Russell now on Red Bull's target list as it battles to get its driver lineup in order, or is its primary focus now untangling itself from the Ricciardo Lawson-Perez web it's made for itself? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to answer those questions and many more from another batch of listener questions are Mark Hughes and Glenn Freeman. Well, Glenn, we'll come to you first. We haven't had you on the pod for a bit. What have you been up to?
Well, away from work, Ed, I have been making the arrangements to, 20 years after I stopped, make a one-off karting return in a couple of weekends' time.
Excellent.
Yeah, very exciting.
Where at and what kart and what are you doing?
Yeah, so it'll be at a track called Ello Park, which is near Lowestoft, where I have raced about 22 years ago, but I think the track layout's changed. It's in a championship run by an organisation called Access Karting, and it's the GX UK Championship. It's kind of a low-cost one that was set up by a guy, without wishing to butcher their origin story, it was set up by a guy who was so outraged by the cost of kind of national-level karting, which has gone out of control in the 20 years since I stopped. And, he decided, no, there needs to be a cheaper alternative, set up this series. They've got brilliant number of entries in their various classes already, so I'm joining them for their season finale. And so that's October 2024, after my dad and I agreed in December 2004 that we would stop karting for 6 months to give ourselves a breather and to give his bank account a breather. So we overshot a little bit. I'm finally coming back just once.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, well, competing in motorsport can mean the bank account needs quite a long breather, you have to say. How about you, Mark? Any racing comebacks planned?
No, just carrying on the bike, just racing against myself, really. No motorised racing plans. Too old for that.
but not too old for hooning around on your push bike.
Oh, that's a completely different thing.
Excellent. Well, two very different approaches there. But as I say, as always, we've got plenty of questions from the Race Members Club to get through. We got through some of them after the race on Sunday, but we've got loads more to dive into. So let's pile into them now. Glenn, you're first up. A question from Chuck Aoki. Is Christian Horner's suggestion Red Bull Racing might look at George Russell for after 2025 a sign of real interest? Or is he just firing back after Toto Wolff spent months openly courting Max?
He would be entitled to fire back after all that public courting of Max. I think they should be considering Russell, though. Didn't Horner make a more tongue-in-cheek comment back around, I'm thinking like China time in April, maybe there was some sort of, well, George Russell's out of contract.
Yeah, we did. It was doing the post-race thing. So we did the Toto Wolff session when he talked about Max Verstappen again, because we kept asking him about him. And then we went to Christian Horner's little session that was being talked about. And yeah, he chucked that George Russell one in. So they were one after the other, basically, in the little huts in the weird archipelago that is the paddock in China. So yeah, that sticks in my mind for that reason.
He also talked when Carlos Sainz was out of contract. He also openly talked about considering Sainz. So, I don't think it's necessarily a dig back at Toto.
Yeah, so I think the China one maybe was a bit more of a dig because, as Ed said, it was kind of in the wake of Toto making more comments about Max at the time. And at that point, it felt like, obviously, as you said there, Ed, Toto was being asked about it, but he was giving pretty extensive answers quite willingly. We're obviously a few months down the road now. The Max stuff has gone away for now. Like I say, I think it should be serious, even if it is just Horner stirring the pot again. And I don't think pot was the word that Toto used over the Singapore weekend. But if you're a team whose driver situation for the next couple of years looks fluid, which I think is a generous but at least fair assessment of Red Bull's situation at the moment, George Russell should be on your radar.
Yeah, it seems perfectly logical to me to do that. And regardless of whether Max Verstappen's there or not, George Russell should be an option. It's been funny with Mercedes because the performance of the car's been so all over the map recently. It's very easy to overlook how good the drivers still are. And obviously George Russell is still an obvious contender. Mark, can you see Russell being a good fit at Red Bull in the future?
Oh, yeah, I'm sure he could be. He's very quick, and that's the main requirement. He's also very level-headed, which when you get the spotlight upon you, making a big move like that, I think he would be fine. I don't think there would be any particular problems to fit a competitive driver into an organisation like Red Bull.
And of course, Glenn, I guess there's a very, very obvious scenario, because we've had people from the Race Members Club asking us about this quite a few times, that let's say Mercedes were to land Max Verstappen for 2026. They've got Russell and Antonelli. If Antonelli does as well as they expect, will Russell be the one who's the spare? So I think it's obvious that if Verstappen does move, and were he to move to Mercedes, and we have to say Aston Martin's a team that could be of interest to him in the future as well, then there potentially will be a very high-level spare from Mercedes. So that makes them interesting in the drivers' market, especially considering Wolff has been very careful to talk about that's their 25 lineup and kind of left some space for 26.
And then got really annoyed saying, well, of course, George is on a really long contract, a long contract that we won't tell you exactly how long it is. I think it's natural with the amount of effort and hype that's coming around Antonelli. It's natural for everybody to assume that, okay, maybe he's ending up in a works Mercedes team earlier than perhaps many people expected. But also, now he's there, or now he's going to be there, it's understandable that nobody sees that as a one-year thing. I think he would have to do a really bad job for Mercedes to think, we've got this wrong. And actually, if Max or anyone else is available, it's Kimi that we need to either put back on the sidelines because it's too much too soon, or we need to find him another berth. If they have a decision to make at the end of 2025... unless George blows Antonelli away, he would surely be the next person to find themselves in the Carlos Sainz situation of this year, where you deserve to be in a top team, but suddenly you lose your drive.
I think there's also an extra dimension to it as well. I'm not sure exactly what the scenario is, but I suspect Russell is also in the sort of general Toto Wolff management sphere as well. So you get that situation like Esteban Ocon had, where he had a Mercedes deal, but he was also tied to Wolff. So presumably, if Red Bull were to be interested in Russell, it would also partly be
Toto gets a cut.
Yeah, well, exactly. He could be part of the management. So ultimately, I've never seen the thing of let's say they do sign Verstappen for 26, and they've got Antonelli and Russell both being very good, and they can only take 2 from 3. That's the definition of good problem to have, isn't it? Because you get to choose 2 from 3 very good options. And still a long way off seeing that happen. But I think any team would be interested in Russell if he was available, because he is operating at a very, very high level. Although I imagine Russell would rather his long-term future were at Mercedes, because he's put the groundwork in there. So, not sure how appealing Red Bull would be for 2026, even if he were out of a drive with Mercedes as well. Also in the world of driver market, Mark, we've got a question that I've kind of put together from two questions, one from Damon Needham and the other from Alex Hindley. With Sergio Perez's struggles and Daniel Ricciardo's seemingly impending dropping, is it likely that Red Bull could promote Yuki Tsunoda and then have two rookies in RB? And if Liam Lawson does take over the Red Bull, has he now got 6 race weekends to prove himself to get in the main Red Bull team in 2025? We should add to this that, as we said on the previous podcast, that seems to be the way it's going, but Red Bull haven't kind of officially done it as yet. They may even do it just after we've recorded this. But we're still working on the base that that's not 100% resolved, but there is at least a clear direction there.
Yeah, so on the assumption that Ricciardo is indeed being stood down and replaced for the last few races by Liam Lawson, I think there is a case to be made that Liam Lawson is being considered for the Red Bull seat currently occupied by Sergio Perez if Checo continues to struggle. But the signs recently are that Checo's begun to turn things around, although he had another nightmare in Singapore. He was super competitive in Baku, and it did seem as if his crisis was had maybe bottomed out. But let's see. There's another 6 races for Checo to perform as well. I would say that if Lawson performs to a very high standard and is a bit of a standout, his chances of going to Red Bull are significantly higher than those of Yuki Tsunoda. For some reason, Christian Horner just doesn't seem to be convinced about Tsunoda at all. I don't think anybody doubts his basic speed. He's a very quick driver. The on-track errors are relatively rare now, but it's just a question of his emotional makeup. And, whoever goes into that seat at Red Bull, it's a very, very tough gig. You've got very, very high expectations upon you, and you are not going to be as quick as Max Verstappen. You just aren't. And how you deal with that is going to be very important in how effective you are in that role. And I don't think there is a belief that Tsunoda would deal well with that situation, regardless of whether that's true or not. The important thing is that that is what Christian Horner seems to believe, and he's running the team. Therefore, that's all that matters. So, no, I don't think Tsunoda's going there. I think the chances are slim. I think the chances of Perez staying there are reasonable. And I think if Perez doesn't perform in the final few races of the season, if it looks just a hopeless case, then I think if Lawson performs well there, then yeah, he's got a realistic chance of going to the senior team.
When we've talked about this before, I have sympathy for Tsunoda that he is not just being overlooked, he's being actively ruled out of that seat. But then you see things. There was a radio out there. He got a bit het up on a radio in Singapore, didn't he? Over sort of some strategy stuff around, I think, Ricciardo as well. That sort of thing, I guess, just reinforces Red Bull's opinion that if you stick him at the front of the grid where the pressure is higher, the spotlight is brighter, he just wouldn't be up to it. I do think that's a shame. We had a bit of a debate in the race work chat the other day when this kind of Lawson coming in early at RB was mentioned, and Scott Mitchell-Malm, who everybody who listens to this podcast will be familiar with, said he couldn't understand. I think he said, sorry, Scott, if you didn't say this. I think he said he couldn't understand why they would bring Lawson in a few races early. I initially said, well, if you know he's in for next year and you know you've written off Daniel Ricciardo, I can see why an organisation as ruthless as the Red Bull wider organisation would just go, let's give him 6 races to get up to speed so he doesn't have to do that at the start of next year. But I can definitely buy into the logic of them going, let's give him 6 races now to see if he would be a better option than Perez for the top team. So I can believe both of those things may be true.
It's just a mess, though, isn't it? Red Bull should be doing so much better than this in terms of their strategy with drivers, with all the opportunities they've got. And it's so out of kilter with everything else about the way that team approaches Formula One. Really weird.
I think they've maybe been caught out by the fact that when they first were doing this stuff, you know, the big junior program and the second F1 team that they could use to blood drivers, they were one of the only places doing it properly and certainly doing it on the scale that they were doing it. A lot of the other teams have got their acts together on that front. They may not cast their net as wide as Red Bull do on the lower ranks in terms of the number of people they actively back. You know, you still see Red Bull liveried cars in a lot of the junior categories. But the way the other teams spot the talent initially and then bring that talent up to potentially F1 level, the other teams have made big strides there and got themselves to a level that they definitely weren't at when Red Bull made this. Red Bull used to look more competent at this than they do now. And I think it just, if everyone else, if you're doing something really well and then other people start doing it well, and that involves that reduces the amount of resource or options that are available to you, that makes your job harder. And I wonder if the way Red Bull goes about finding and managing and nurturing talent just hasn't evolved perhaps to the level of professionalism or detail that some of the other teams are now doing it.
Yeah, and that's something Red Bull have made noises about trying to address. They've done a few things to start to do that, but yeah, they need to get their F1 lineups a bit more stable and sensible and strategic, I would say. And yeah, we're still waiting for the final announcement and decision on what they do for the rest of the season. But yeah, you never know, because they can turn on a sixpence in terms of their ideas and what they're going to do. Also related on this is a question I'll take from Matthew McMahon. If Singapore was Daniel Ricciardo's last race, do you think this is the end of his F1 career?
Yes.
Well, yes, absolutely. I was going to say the same thing, but slightly longer. A, Ricciardo's made it clear he's not interested in making up the numbers in F1. And B, there's no other opportunities for him anyway, because nobody's interested. So the whole point of coming back with Red Bull was that it offered a potential pathway to a front-running car. So at whatever point that becomes completely impossible, i.e. the moment he gets dropped, that was always likely to be it. And everything he's been saying lately is that he's given it a go, but he's 35. His stints at RB and McLaren have only very sporadically produced anything approaching the old magic. And I think everything that he's said and done indicates that once the Red Bull Avenue is closed in F1, that's it. I mean, if Ferrari suddenly phoned him up and said, "Oh, do you want to drive?" I'm sure he'll say yes, but they're not going to. Even if they had a seat, there'd be other drivers they'd be chasing. So yeah, I think this is going to be the end for Daniel Ricciardo in Formula One. You never know, something may happen, but I think he's happy with the fact he's given it a go after the McLaren nightmare, and there was a possible way back to the front, and yeah, it's not worked out. So that's going to be on to other things for Ricciardo, whether that's other things in racing or other things in the wider world.
Time now to tell you about the sponsor of this episode, Grammarly. Do you struggle with when to use fewer instead of less? Do you find yourself writing important emails which, when you look back on them, take far too long to get to the point? Are you guilty of exclamation marks and too much jargon? Well, Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you find the words you need and the right text for your context. It learns your personal style and your brand or company style to give you personalised suggestions based on what you're writing and who's going to read it. Grammarly works across all the apps and sites you use like Word, Google Docs, Pages, Slack and more, so there's no need to copy and paste. Grammarly works where you work. Smart features like tone suggestions help you navigate even the most difficult work conversations. And what's more, data privacy and security are woven into the foundations of Grammarly. It's the gold standard of responsible AI, with 15 years of best-in-class communication, trusted by tens of millions of professionals and IT departments. So get AI writing support that works where you work. Download Grammarly for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Grammarly. Easier said, done.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
Right, let's move on to a another batch of questions, slightly different topic. We're looking a little bit more in the middle of the grid now. And Glenn, I've put together a question from 4 questions we received from Ansi Rullamo, Daryl Finch, Jake Nelson and Chris Casablanca. Is Franco Colapinto potentially damaging Alex Albon's reputation? Given he's immediately very close to Albon's pace, do we need to reevaluate Albon's performance? Are we seeing the reputation Albon built up over the past few years dented? And is Alex Albon being found out?
Oh, found out. Firstly, when you get that many questions on a topic, you realise that there's clearly something there among the fan base. So thank you to everyone who sent those in. Found out might be a bit harsh, but I think we can view this as a useful tune-up for him, for Albon, before Sainz comes in. I think we all felt that, if any of us felt we needed a definitive answer on where Albon's level is after his Williams rehabilitation, Carlos Sainz being your teammate is going to give us those answers. It is hard to judge exactly how well any driver is performing, not only in a lesser car, but when they're in a lesser car with a weak teammate, which is what Albon has had so far. I think he has personally flourished in the Williams environment compared to the Red Bull setup, but the situation he's been in up to now, he can only do what his car allows him to do, and he can only beat who's in the other car in the garage with him. And until Colapinto came in, there hasn't been a challenge from the other side of the garage. You obviously do get drivers who excel in lesser cars and couldn't do it at the front. So as good as Albon has been at Williams, it doesn't necessarily mean that he would be ready for another shot in a front running car. I don't think it will take us long. Like I say, I don't think he's being found out right now, but I don't think it will take us long to get a definitive answer next year alongside Sainz. It's only going to be a few races before we really know. And I tend to look at it more not as Colapinto's brilliant performances being a black mark against Albon. I think sometimes we can just celebrate and praise the fact that it's to Colapinto's massive credit that he's come in with this kind of left field opportunity, or this, he wasn't massively on the F1 radar outside of being Williams's junior driver. He's come in and hit the ground running and made a real impression. And we are going to talk about him in relation to other seats beyond the handful of races he has with Williams. And I think that is utterly warranted because he's done an incredible job. I love it when someone gets an unexpected opportunity like this. They grab it with both hands and they try to make something of it. Ed, you and I were talking the other day, and I used the phrase that he's trying to Kobayashi his way into an F1 career here.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. Kamui Kobayashi in 2009 got those 2 races for Toyota because Timo Glock got the injury from the crash he had in qualifying in Suzuka, and I think a bit of ballast was dislodged from his front wing and came through the chassis and injured him. Kobayashi had 2 not particularly good years in F2. His European career was fizzling out. But he drove superbly in those 2 races, got points in Abu Dhabi, made a real impression, and suddenly he just went from a driver who was nowhere near Formula One into one who got a Sauber drive the following year. So, very much a Kobayashi kind of thing. I must admit, I kind of agree with you in terms of this narrative. I suppose thinking about it, it's not a surprise it's arisen. But I don't think of it as, Colapinto's made a really good impression. That means Alex Albon's a bit rubbish or overrated. That there have been various situational things that I think have held Albon back. Take Baku. Obviously, he had the fan problem with Q3, so didn't get his second Q3 run, and he'd have been ahead of Colapinto there, as you'd expect. That's nothing brilliant. That's where you'd expect him to be. And then obviously, the way the race have panned out, having the upgrade on for Singapore on paper should have been better, but I'm not sure that suspension upgrade particularly showed its value, should we say, in Singapore. So yeah, it's great for Colapinto, but I think you'd have to see things going on for a lot longer before it would damage Albon's reputation, which to me is built on a lot more than just the fact he was a lot quicker than Latifi and Sargent. That was a minor point. It was more all round what he's doing at Williams, and he's still doing as Williams. So yeah, like I always say, it's not a zero-sum game. Albon is still doing really, really well, superbly at Williams. Colapinto has done a brilliant job coming in and potentially changed his career trajectory.
Yeah, I'd say credit to Williams for having the having the guts to put their guy in. You know, they had external options as well, but they've gone. Franco's the one who we've been trying to groom into a potential, star F1 driver, or give him something. Even if they didn't have a seat for him, they've been trying to develop him. So they've given him his shot. Massive credit to Williams for that. I will happily come back, having mentioned all the science stuff in my answer, Ed. I'll happily come back, 6 races into 2025, and then I'll tell these guys if Alex Albon has been found out by Carlos Sainz.
Well, that's going to be a very, very interesting comparison. Right, well, you mentioned Kobayashi there and the fact he went to Sauber, and there's talk about Colapinto maybe going to Sauber, Mark, and that's what the next question addresses from Paul Balkazak, who says, Sauber and RB still have an open seat. Is Sauber and should Sauber consider Colapinto?
I think there should be. I think if no final decision has been made on Valtteri Bottas, I think if they're still looking to keep their options open, he's a very obvious contender, as would be Gabriel Bortoleto from F2. So, you get these guys that you don't see their ultimate potential immediately, and Colapinto is definitely one of those. People are all different. People have different sets of circumstances, so they develop at different rates. Colapinto has shown extraordinary ability to sort of grab the ball and run with it. He's got incredible self-confidence in his own ability. There's feedback from his junior teams is that sometimes his confidence wasn't matched by his all-round ability. There were still areas that he was weak in that he needed to address. But I think he's got the level where he's begun to understand that and then fill in the missing pieces. And he looks absolutely terrific so far. So I'd be very keen if I was Saba to continue to monitor in the remaining races of this season. And you have Bottas as your fallback, but you know what you're going to get with Valtteri. You're going to get a good level professional driver. But as Sauber transitioning into Audi, there's no urgency to have an absolute front rank driver in this next season. You can afford to be looking at developing a driver. So yeah, I would still be open to looking at that because you have two known quantities in Nico Hülkenberg and Valtteri Bottas. You know what you're going to get with those. You're going to get good level drivers, and they have their own strengths and weaknesses. But you just might get something a little bit more than that, potentially more than that, when you're looking at rookies whose potential is as yet unknown.
There was also RB mentioned in that question, although not directly as an option. Glenn, do you think that you could see RB Nick de Vriesing Colapinto or something?
Well, we have to already point out that the sample set of races and data we have to go on Colapinto is vast compared to the sample set Helmut Marko had before he went, yep, we'll have Nick de Vries. De Vries was impressive, very impressive, standing in as a one-off for Williams at Monza, but Marko's or Red Bull's assessment seemed to overlook the fact that Monza was the ideal track for Williams with the way its car behaved back then. I think everyone else could see. And I know Marko actually said before they dropped De Vries the following season, Marko even said that Christian Horner didn't agree with the idea of signing De Vries. And I can completely see why. He did a great job for one race in the perfect car to drive at Monza. So this time with Colapinto, if he keeps doing a good job over the coming races, based on how they made the decision before, this time they'd have ample evidence to go on. And yeah, I think if he keeps doing a good job, if he keeps turning up and performing to the level that he's showing already and is, isn't making stupid mistakes, doesn't have huge fluctuations in his performance, then yeah, if RB is about to have a vacancy, it wouldn't be the worst snap judgment they've ever made. So I do think he should be in consideration for both of those seats.
You also have Isaac Hadjar, of course, their own F2 driver. So yeah, there are plenty of options there.
Options are never the problem for Red Bull with its drivers in F1, are they? But how it shuffles those options and manages that is a bigger question. Connected to that is a question I'll take from Scott Keogh. Should Valtteri Bottas be worried despite the feeling that a renewal for him was becoming increasingly likely? Yeah, I think any driver who hasn't got a deal when there's hardly any drives left will be worried until it's done. As I understand it, the negotiations there are still sort of going reasonably constructively. Still got a decent chance of getting that seat. I must admit, I actually think that team would do very well to keep Bottas because of where they are. It's not about... I mean, I'd like to see Colapinto stay on the grid, actually. But I think in Sauber's position, what Bottas brings is quite valuable to a team that really needs to up its game and sharpen things up a bit more. Now, you could say he hasn't played a part in doing that over the past few years, but I think both drivers there have been a bit frustrated with the way things were being done around them and perhaps maybe feel they weren't listened to as much as they should have been. So I think actually Bottas is a resource that team can really lean on. There's talk of a 1+1 contract, so 25, and then the option for 26. So I think that would be a very, very sensible move for Sauber, and I can see Mattia Binotto going that way with it. If it was a different team, I might make a different argument. But yeah, I'm sure Bottas is worried about it, though. Until he's got something signed up, because it's not a foregone conclusion, then he's going to be a little bit worried, ultimately, because if he doesn't get the Sauber deal, his F1 career is certainly for 25 not happening and is probably over.
Yeah, it'd be very hard to get back in, I think. He definitely should be worried, but I also think Audi, Sauber, that whole organisation, the position they're now in, I don't think they need to rush. You know, Bottas, if Bottas is your sort of safe pair of hands option, he's not going anywhere. I assume he's still going to be available in December. You have time. If you're evaluating Colapinto, you have time to allow him to have more races. You have time to let the Red Bull situation play out. We were talking earlier, is Liam Lawson potentially getting audition for Sergio Perez's seat? If Perez comes on the market, he may be viewed as damaged goods by the top teams, but he would potentially be a superb addition to a team in Sauber/Audi's situation. So I think they should definitely wait and just see what else happens, because kind of as you've outlined there, Ed, if the worst case scenario is you end up with Bottas, that's not a disaster.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he'll do a good job for them. And yeah, it's not like the scenario was a while ago when he was sort of on everyone's list, but he was never quite number one on anyone's list. And I thought he was going to be pretty well set. I'd have thought he'd have been done by now. So yeah, he will be a little bit worried and glancing over his shoulder and looking at other opportunities. And it could also, of course, come down to the availability of people like Colapinto and Bortoleto. Williams seem happy to negotiate on Colapinto, but they've got him under contract, so that might cost a bit in terms of buyout. Sauber will want to actually own the driver that they're signing in terms of owning their contract, as it were. So sort of a loan deal for Bortoleto, which is what McLaren appear to prefer, doesn't seem to be very viable, and a buyout would probably be far too high to justify it there. So yeah, interesting to see how that particular seat goes. Right, we move on to part 3 now, and we've got a whole batch of questions on all sorts of unconnected topics now. Glenn, first up, a nice challenging one for you from Declan Mashan. Why is F1 trying to remove all authenticity from its drivers? The most iconic moments in F1 come down to drivers being themselves, and it's being stripped away. Censoring the drivers is another step towards turning the sport into a grey and motionless miasma. Elite sport is not all sunshines and rainbows.
Some good words in there, Declan. Obviously, this is related to the supposed desired clampdown on swearing from the FIA. I think, we've already discussed this on the Race YouTube channel, haven't we, Ed? I have no problem with asking people not to swear in FIA press conferences. I think that's fine. If that's the FIA's domain, it does go out, it does get broadcast, all that sort of thing. If you want to say to people, please don't swear in our press conferences, I think that's a perfectly reasonable request, providing you make it in a perfectly reasonable way and you talk to these people like adults. What I have a problem with is how heavy-handed the FIA was in trying to enforce this and presumably trying to make an example of its world champion, Max Verstappen, by giving him this community service nonsense. That's just problematic. That's not the way to treat people, particularly at the beginning of this clampdown. It's not like Max has been asked 6 months ago and told repeatedly, come on, please stop swearing. We're asking you nicely. And they've gone, we've got no choice but to slap you with a punishment here. As soon as it comes out in public that the FIA may want this to be something that gets tidied up, at the first opportunity for one kind of flippant use of the F word, we're getting stewards involved and formal punishments, utter nonsense. Looking beyond that, and the stuff in the question about censoring drivers and removing all authenticity and that, things like stopping them swearing on the radio, impossible. You're never going to be able to get these guys to, and nor should they, have to think about moderating their language literally in the heat of battle when they're over the radio. So if you're the FIA and you have a problem with that, really you have to go to the F1 broadcast team saying you don't want to hear as much bleeped out swearing on the broadcast and ask them to use it less on the broadcast. And F1 will say no because they know it adds value to the broadcast for the reasons really that Declan outlined in the question. Fans want to know what the driver's really thinking in the heat of the moment. There is an authenticity to radio messages because you can't have a PR person on the radio going, oh, someone's just put you on the grass, but please make sure you don't now slag them off because then people will put that on social media. None of that's going to happen. So, yeah, I think the FIA is fighting a losing battle on that sort of stuff. And as I say, it adds value. It adds value to the broadcast, so it's going nowhere.
And as you alluded to in that question, it's not the whole of F1 trying to do it. It is the FIA. The F1 is basically made up of three things, really. It's the FIA, the regulator, F1/FOM, whatever you want to call it, the commercial rights holder, and then the teams. And you could argue there's the promoters as the sort of fourth pillar of that. But yeah, this is the FIA that is doing this, and this appears to be driven by the president of the FIA rather than F1 as a whole. Look at how much publicity F1's got from Gunther Steiner, whose whole brand is basically swearing in terms of how he's pushed on Netflix. So yeah, it is quite a curious one. Mark, a question from Ryan Lahif. We see Lewis Hamilton advocating so much for positivity in life out of the car, but in the car he seems to spiral into negativity incredibly quickly, as we saw from his onboards during the Singapore Grand Prix. What do you attribute this negative mentality to, and has it become more obvious during the latter years of his career?
I'd attribute it to his intense competitiveness and the fact that he's for several years now been struggling with equipment with which he can't express himself properly competitively. So it is just him building himself up and regrouping after every disappointment and getting himself back into a headspace where he's going to hope that this time they can pull something worthwhile out of the car. And when it's not there, that competitiveness just surfaces as that. He's been around for a long time. He doesn't have that many competitive years left, and time is ticking by, and yet another weekend being effectively wasted. So I think it comes from that place. I don't think it's within him as a person. I don't think he's a negative person. I think he's a very positive person. I just think it's the competitor that you're hearing in the heat of the moment.
It's frustration, isn't it? And it comes back kind of to the question we were just discussing, where you do get those raw heat of the moment kind of natural reactions to things. If Lewis is having a bad day, he's more likely to be annoyed over the radio. I used to occasionally get frustrated with him when Mercedes were at their absolute most dominant. If something went wrong or he got involved in an incident and would end up at the back of the field, perhaps a bit of damage, he'd be driving around in 18th place or something. The car doesn't feel nice to drive. And he'd be on the radio going, guys, I think we should retire. And then the pit wall would say, well, no, we've worked it out. We think you can get back to 8th or something like that. There are points on the table here, Lewis. Come on. And he'd keep grumbling and go, no, the car feels horrible. Why don't we just... And he would always eventually resort to, let's save the engine. That's his way of trying to get through to the team. That used to bother me a bit because, kind of as the question hinted, Lewis is very... When things are going well, he's always, you should never give up. Never know when you're beaten. Never stay down. And then I would think, come on, you've still got a good car. Your team are telling you a points here, but you're in a mood because your race has gone wrong. But that's racing drivers, isn't it? As Mark said, they're fiercely competitive, and if they're used to being at the front and it's not going very well, they get the hump, don't they?
I actually think, just to slightly expand the scope of the question, because he often is the same when he's just out of the car. So when he speaks to TV or us just after qualifying or the race, he used to do a little media session a little bit longer after the race, for example. And he was always way better in that because he'd had the chance to sort of relax after the race, to absorb and understand what had gone on and really understand what he thought about it. And he would always be a way more reflective person there, which was closer to the kind of real Lewis Hamilton. I feel he always came across way, way better, as pretty much everyone would, given a little bit of time to do that. And I think it's a little bit of a shame in many ways, because it means the percentage of time people see and hear from him, more of the time he's kind of in that sort of race mode where quite understandably it doesn't come across quite as well as it might do, and you don't see so much of the depth and how reflexive and insightful he is of his own performance when he's had a little bit of time.
I'm glad you mentioned the other drivers there, because I imagine, although I'm sure they all like this kind of setup you guys have in the paddock now, where it's kind of a big TV blast and then a media pen blast and then you're done with it, as you say, Ed, it means that more of them are giving more quotes while they are still a bit hot and bothered and haven't had time to maybe process stuff, or, sometimes have someone have a little word in their ear and say, just try to lean away from questions about this and lean into stuff about this. Obviously, then the media, we do it a bit, but not as much as some others, will use those quotes for days on end on the run up to the next race. And I imagine sometimes the drivers will be seeing a quote on, say, a Wednesday that they've given 45 minutes after they've got out of the car on a Sunday, and they probably even see it and go, oh, why did I say that? And, well, probably their first reaction is, why are the media using that? But deep down, it's, why did I say that? Because, as you say, they've not had time to cool down. It can be good for us in that it means that you tend to get a bit more raw emotion from them. But as you say, Ed, the flip side of that is you also lose the chance to get more considered answers from these people from time to time.
Yeah, which are certainly the ones that I tend to prefer. The next question comes from Rob Borkowski that I'll answer. How would the running order have been determined if there had been another Q3 incident that prevented anyone from finishing a flying lap in Singapore? Obviously, that was the Sainz crash, and only two people had set a legal lap time at that point, which was Piastri and Hülkenberg, I think. So the rules do cover it. So let's say they'd gone out again and there'd been another red flag and they didn't have time to set any more time. So you'd have had Piastri and Hülkenberg would be 1 and 2 because they'd set times. Verstappen had set a time, but it had been disallowed because of track limit. No, because of the red flag rather. So yeah, that wouldn't have counted. But basically, the order is firstly your order of lap time, and then you're done in order of those who started a flying lap, those who failed to start a flying lap, and those who failed to leave the pits. So you've got a few little groups there. And then you've got the question of how they'd be sorted out between that. If obviously 8 drivers hadn't done it, they can go back to, I think they can still do this. The regs actually aren't super clear on this, but they have in the past gone back to previous qualifying segments to differentiate among those. Although the way the regs are written, they could decide in terms of order of who started flying laps and that kind of thing, but I think they probably shy away from that. But it's quite difficult to have a session, even a Q3 session, where people don't set times, because you would need the red flags to be at exactly the right time for that to happen. But yeah, it is covered by the regulations. But it would have been great news for Piastri and Hülkenberg if it had happened. So Glenn, another question that's a mix and match from 4 questions in this case, from Stuart Harland, Simon Partridge, Too Blindingly Fast, and Hell on Wheels. Given Daniel Ricciardo pitted late to take fastest lap from Lando Norris, is it time for Red Bull to sell RB? Is it time for F1 to do something about this unfair advantage? Is it in F1's interest that Red Bull has control over 4 cars, and is it unhealthy for F1?
I don't think it's in F1's interest now, but it was in 2005 when Dietrich Mateschitz bought Minardi and helped Bernie Ecclestone keep enough cars on the grid. That's why we're in this situation now. In an ideal world, you would get Red Bull to sell this team. Why not to Andretti would be my suggestion. But you also can't really force them to sell. It's an asset they legitimately own and have run for 2 decades. Now, I imagine, though, based on what happened in Singapore, you in F1 and the FIA's position right now, you would be keeping a very close eye on how those two teams behave and interact, especially with what could become a very close title fight developing for Red Bull this year, and a title fight where Red Bull is potentially on the back foot. So it so far it's tended to be about limiting losses rather than trying to beat McLaren again. So I think that extra scrutiny would probably be justified at the moment, and it may prevent anything else going on. It might make anyone involved think twice, even about acting kind of instinctively, rather than, I don't think anyone's about to leave a paper trail of, can you just go and get fastest lap, or can you get in the way of our rivals when they're lapping you, or anything like that. I know there have been times in the past, haven't there, perhaps when this team was AlphaTauri, where it almost felt like they were going out of their way not to help Red Bull and making sure that they weren't seen to be offering accidental assistance, as I say, when being lapped. We did have that, we have a safety car or VSC at Zandvoort a couple of years ago that looked very suspicious and everyone got very angry about. Like I say, I can imagine over the rest of this year, people will be watching this stuff quite closely now, having been alerted to the possibility of it, of what happened in Singapore.
Yeah, the very fact that there's suspicion tells you why so many sports have this rule preventing any kind of common ownership. It's just a good thing to do, regardless of things. And yeah, the fact that Red Bull have done it for so long makes it a little bit tricky to untangle. But yeah, there's ways you can perhaps encourage a sale. Let's put it that way. Mark, a question from Jacobus VDL. George Russell has been getting very vocal about inconsistent and unpredictable behaviour of tyres over the past couple of races, and possibly longer. Is he expressing the views of many teams and drivers? And are there really wildly variable performance differences between individual sets of tyres? Or is it just George who is expressing these kinds of views? And Eddard Gaming asks why both teams and Pirelli do not seem to understand the tyres.
It's George who's been the most vociferous recently, but he's not by no means a lone voice. The problem is it's very difficult to definitively know that it's differences between tyre sets, i.e. inconsistencies between two supposedly identical specifications of sets of tyres, rather than these tyres generically are extremely sensitive to the slightest change in track temperature, track grip, moisture in the air, all these things, car balance, and how the fronts come up to temperature and the speed at which they do so before the rears have got too hot, and the slightest little change in circumstances to your outlap, if you've had to back off a little bit more than you did on the previous lap because there's a car in front of you. All of these things, the tyres are extremely sensitive to. That's just built into the type of tyre they are. To rely very heavily on compounds with a relatively simple, relatively weak construction. So it's a very compound, sensitive tyre. So it's very difficult to know whether it's actually, a quality control problem, which Pirelli insists it's not. They would say that, or just an oversensitivity problem. As to whether teams understand it, no, in general, it's still a bit of a black art. You can go to a tyre engineer and they can explain why something has happened the way it has happened afterwards, but they don't behave in a way, no tyre, not just a Pirelli, behaves in a way that you can accurately model beforehand, unlike with an aerodynamic setup or a suspension setup or something like that. They're not linear in their behaviour. Just in their very nature, it's just the way it is. So when you got a mixture of, a structure which is bending and then bending back into shape to create the grip, so you got a structural implication together with a chemical element. How the surface of the tyre is interacting with the surface of the track at a molecular level, which is changing all the time according to the surface of track and all those things we talked about before, temperature in particular. They are just intrinsically that way. And if you have them on cars which have got more torque, more weight, more downforce than any before, they're going to become even more like that. So, a bit of a generic problem, I think, a lot more complicated than just this set's not as good as the last set.
Plus, of course, the tyres are always attached to the cars, aren't they? And Russell's in one of the more capricious cars that's out there on the grid. So you don't hear McLaren drivers complaining about it quite so much. So there's also that element in which the way the tyres behave reflects also what the cars do as well. So yeah, that's another complicating factor in an already very complicated interrelationship of factors. Right, a question I'll take from Mariosh. With Red Bull successfully getting McLaren's rear wing altered and now focusing on their front wing, are these political manoeuvres going to give Max Verstappen the final push for the title and possibly keep the team in the hunt for the constructors? Well, I think the change of the rear wing, I don't think Red Bull were actually the prime mover on that. And we should also add that McLaren have said they offered to make changes proactively in order to diffuse the concerns about it. I don't think it's actually going to make a huge difference because that wing, which is the lower downforce one, but that deflects handily, it's only really Las Vegas that would be useful for. So they've had it for the golden period, if you like. My suspicion would be McLaren calculated that and thought, well, if we get it working for, Spa and Monza and Baku, that's ideal, and perhaps that's what they got. These things always go on in the background. I actually don't think it's going to make a huge difference in terms of whether Verstappen wins the Drivers' Championship. I don't think there's much that can keep Red Bull in the hunt for the Constructors' Championship other than Red Bull taking a big step with their Austin upgrade. I think that's, with the current trajectory, lost pretty much because McLaren have got two drivers who are scoring heavy points and Red Bull don't. So even if Red Bull take a step forward, it's going to be hard to catch that up. I don't think the question's suggesting this, but I don't think there's any political desire to try and interfere with the championship or help things in that regard. So, yeah, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference, and it's just part of the general battle that goes on. The flexible bodywork thing will go on and on indefinitely because you've got the rule that says you can't have the bodywork flexing, but you have to have some flexibility. So how much is the allowable flexibility, etc., etc. Teams will always push the boundaries. Teams who aren't doing it will always complain, and the identity of the teams will always change. This time it's McLaren, next time it'll be Mercedes, next time it'll be Red Bull, and maybe it'll be Ferrari if they can actually get flexible bodywork right for once. So yeah, it's just one of those ongoing things. Got a question from Gordon Ross. Will Max Verstappen do a Jensen Button and win the title without winning another race this season?
Yeah, I think he probably will win somewhere. If you look at Lando Norris's most dominant wins, Zandvoort and Singapore, Max has still been second. He's still beating everyone else. And Red Bull, I would say, weren't as bad in Baku as Singapore as some of us, myself included, may have been expecting. So that might hint at the fact that they're getting the car back into a workable window, and that might help keep Max even more in the hunt when we get back to more conventional tracks. So I'd say the drop-off isn't as big or as stark or as sustained as Button and Brawn experienced in 2009. We have to remember that Rubens Barrichello won a couple of races later in that year. So I think you have to attribute some of the drop-off in 2009 to Jensen. I think that Red Bull have shown more signs of rebounding, or Red Bull and Max have shown more signs of rebounding than Brawn and Jensen did. And I would point out that Max's head hasn't gone in the same way that I believe Button's did in the middle of 2009.
The next question, Mark, also on the championship from Ryan Norrie. Does the Drivers' Championship now potentially hinge on the upgrades Red Bull are bringing to Austin? It feels as if they don't get it right. Verstappen will need to have 6 mega races to try and stop Norris closing that 52-point gap.
I think as things stand at the moment, it would have to be one hell of an upgrade to put the Red Bull back ahead of the McLaren. I think it's just about defending a big points lead. So all Max has to do is not allow Lando to take an average of something like 7 points per race per meeting off him, something like that. And I think that's perfectly feasible with the car, even as it is now. I still think the odds are very much in his favour. So, no, I don't think that. Obviously, if the upgrade works very well, it makes Max's job easier and thereby increases his chances of holding on to it. But I think even if it's not, his chances are still very good.
And also on the championship, a question I'll take, which is a merger of Thomas Knight's and Ben Clarkson's question. Was Singapore another weekend where the point swing between Norris and Verstappen should have been larger, but poor qualifying or races from Oscar Piastri and Ferrari enabled Max Verstappen to minimise the damage? And will Piastri not finishing closer to his teammate potentially be a deciding factor in the Drivers' Championship? These situations are significant because I always say that although people talk about second drivers in leading teams as important for the Constructors' Championship, they are important for the Drivers' Championship as well, because ideally you want someone taking points off your rival, which Piastri does sometimes, but Piastri also sometimes takes points off Norris. So it can be a double-edged sword, that one. But yeah, potentially that sort of thing could be decisive, because let's say Verstappen is just on damage limitation for the remaining 6 races. It's get the best result you can. Nick at win if there's one on offer, get second, third, fourth places. Well, Singapore, if Ferrari hadn't messed up qualifying, every chance the Ferraris could have been ahead of him. Piastri certainly had the car to be ahead of him. So suddenly the calculation's very different if Verstappen's got 3 more cars ahead of him. So that kind of illustrates it. But that's the thing that I think puts Verstappen still in a nice position, is that A, he's very good, and B, his team's very good. So even though they're struggling with the car, they're very good at coming through weekends with a pretty good result. But yeah, people like Piastri and the Ferraris and the Mercedes drivers can be significant factors, but they can also take points off Norris as well. So yeah, it's why the championship battle isn't as simple as saying, oh, well, if Norris wins every race and Verstappen's second or whatever, because that just won't happen. Not with how close it's been recently. And yeah, those players will be key. So yeah, all drivers can do is make sure they maximise their performance on any given weekend, and hope that maybe factors play in their favour. But that's potentially key. And Norris in particular will be the one who will want cars doing that to try and amplify the amount of points he's taking off Verstappen, because he's not gaining at a fast enough rate, unfortunately. I think even in Singapore, where he won, because the number of races running out, the average points per race actually went up a little bit mathematically from that, because obviously
about 8.6 per weekend or something like that now.
Yeah, it's something like that. And I know there's sprint races to factor in as well, but yeah, it just shows how hard it is to play catch up. Historically, playing catch up is difficult even with a quicker car. Right, Glenn, a question from Chris Ford. With McLaren extending their advantage in the Constructors' Championship with another strong result in Singapore, when will they be tempted to focus on full tilt development for 2025 and stop developing for this season? And will any other teams be thinking the same? Perhaps Red Bull have conceded their championship hopes for next year.
Well, for next year, that's interesting. I think Red Bull probably have privately conceded the Constructors' Championship for this year. We are in a period of stable regulations, though. And approaching the final year of those regulations. So I don't see this 24 into 25 being one of those big winters where it's about, when are you going to shift your resources and who can steal a march and that sort of thing. I think that most of the 25 cars are going to be very similar and just be evolutions of the 24 cars. So stuff you learn on your current car is likely to carry over for next year. So I don't see this being one of those winters, and this will be totally different when we're getting into 2026, where the rules change. But this isn't one of those winters where you can go, right, switch off the 2024 car, switch on the 25 car, and we'll be much quicker when we get to Australia in March 2025.
Mark, the final question that you'll take is from Nick Jack. Oscar Piastri has made a huge step on Sundays, but I can't help but feel he's butchered more than half a dozen Q3 final runs this season, something that was actually his strength last year. Any thoughts on what's happening here?
Yeah, I think he's becoming more complete. He's more consistently competitive throughout a race weekend than was the case even in the first half of this season. I think in the latter half of this season, he's become more consistent. But that puts the big pressure on him to deliver a perfect qualifying lap when your teammate is as quick as Lando Norris. So I think he's just not quite got that handle on the last little edge of the tyres that when you need those last half a tenth or so. And Lando's just very, very good at delivering those. And I think I think it's a bit harsh to say he's butchered them. He's butchered some sessions, but he's definitely not been as consistently quick in qualifying as Lando, but he quite often makes amends in the race.
And the final question for this podcast from Ian Carlin I'll take. Is there any underlying thought process for the VCARB strategy each weekend? It seems like they always send one driver out with an incoherent alternative strategy, but in Singapore, they put both drivers onto softs, including Yuki Tsunoda, after doing over 50% of the race on mediums. What are they attempting to do week in and week out? Yeah. Yeah, this team has started to do that a little bit at times recently. I think some of it is situational. So, for example, their Ricciardo strategy, he fell in Q1. They knew there was only going to be one pit stop for most, so they just gambled on putting him on softs and seeing if he could leap up the order early on. And when he couldn't, then it was just, well, he just had to pit for the hards. And yeah, so a race that was going nowhere was then going nowhere even more. Tsunoda was a bit more odd, yeah, starting off with the mediums, then ending up on the softs. I'm not entirely sure why they went to the softs there, but then again, they did stand up okay. So yeah, medium hard was obviously the conventional strategy there. And then you have a race like Azerbaijan where they did the alternate strategy with Ricciardo. He ran very, very long on the mediums, but that one ended up being a bit weird because he started on the hards rather. Went long, and then they just left him out in hope of a safety car. So he stopped right at the very end of the race, but his race was pretty much done. So they were hoping for some divine intervention. Tsunoda actually was on the normal strategy. He started on the mediums there, but got driven into on the first lap, or rather collided with Stroll. Because I don't think Stroll was particularly out of line with trying to make that move, even if it did maybe violate the rather overly simplistic guidelines the stewards use. So yeah, they do it a little bit too often, but they're in a weird position now, that team, in that their car often isn't quite quick enough to be 9th, 10th on merit. So maybe they try a little bit too hard sometimes. Certainly when you're low down the grid, I understand doing it, but it's always good to have one car on the correct strategy, which, sometimes they don't. Well, another great batch of questions there. Thanks to everyone who sent them in. Apologies that we can't get through absolutely all of them. Thanks very much to Glenn and Mark for your answers. Long gap coming up, but we're going to keep on podcasting, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.
College football is back like never before. I'm David Ubben, and I host Until Saturday, the Athletics Leveled Up College Football Podcast. 3 times a week, you'll hear me and my co-hosts, fellow Athletics senior writer Chris Vanini and 2-time national champion Damian Harris, embrace the sport's new madness with you. We're also just going to have a ton of fun enjoying all the things that make college football great. Check out the brand new Until Saturday, every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday this fall. You can find us wherever you listen to your podcasts.